I'll be speaking about infrastructure power, how governments are reshaping global internet points of control. So basically what I'm trying to understand through my research is how power is being exercised over and within the internet. So as you might have heard, back in 1996, John Perry Barlow argued that the governments should not get involved in internet regulation. He basically said, I asked you of the past to leave us alone. You have no sovereignty where we gather. 4 years after that, Bill Clinton, when he was discussing how the Chinese were trying to manage internet information controls, he said, good luck. It's sort of like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall, basically saying it's not possible to establish information controls. And so part of the complexity of the internet is that it's a network of networks. So in every layer of the internet stack, say it's content, and so we can see the links on different websites and how websites link to each other, whether or not this is a distributed system or a more centralized system. So in terms of content, we could think of what's happening with TikTok and Instagram, for example. A lot of websites are pointing to TikTok and pointing to Instagram. There's very few outlinks from these two platforms, and so it looks a bit more like a centralized system. Similarly, we have that on the infrastructure layers and so on. And so a lot of people looking at internet governance argue that it's a polycentric system, and so it's very complicated to understand how power is exercised over and within the internet, while some other academics like Laura De Nardis, who's based here at Georgetown, argue, well, we should basically start looking at the points of control. So there are specific points within the network that operate like choke points, or points of control is the term that she uses. And so I would argue that what's been happening is that Barlow's dream was that we would have a distributed system. Over time, we've come to something that is much more centralized. And so it's becoming more possible to exercise control over the internet. And so these are what I would argue in simplistic terms how a point of control looks like within a network. And so what's happening right now is that the fragmentation narrative is starting to die. We see that in the US since the previous Trump administration. Very openly, the government is pushing for what it called a clean network, so a split, in part perhaps because there's fear that China might take over this centralized network. If there is a point of control, the question is who's going to be controlling that point of control? And there seems to be concern that it might be China. And so what I'm presenting today is part of a paper. I'm just going to present the three first strategies. So what I argue is that governments across the world are starting to see these points of control, and they're trying to manage them in different ways. And so, for example, the first example is Brazil. Brazil had all its internet traffic being routed through the US to Europe. It uncovered, well, Snowden uncovered that those landing points were being tapped into by the NSA. And so when that was revealed, they expedited the L08 cable in order to basically route outside the US. Be able to connect Brazil to Europe directly so that their communications weren't being tapped into. So a second strategy is to neutralize the point of control. So you don't route around it, but in the case of India, for example, they uncovered that the points between the buyer and the seller were highly consolidated. Basically, the marketplaces we all interact with, say, Amazon, and sometimes the sellers are no longer in Amazon. You have to contact them elsewhere. The problem you have is your reputation as a seller is trapped within Amazon, right? All the sales you made, all your 5-star reviews are in Amazon. If you want to shift to another platform, you can't. So what did the Indian government do? They basically separated the identity component from the platform and allow you to sell your product, say, on Amazon with an Amazon identity, but to a buyer who might be on Flipkart, for example. And so in that way, they didn't bypass the point of control, but they basically neutralized it. They allow Amazon to continue operating, but they don't allow them to keep control over that identity. And the third one is what's been happening in the EU. So Apple controls 32% of the EU market. Apple has a very closed ecosystem. Basically, if you want to download an app and you're a European citizen or a citizen anywhere. You basically have to go to an app store and get the app. And so they were very concerned about how Apple was exercising that power. In particular, it controls the availability of apps. It decides whether an app is up or down, and it's charging a 30% commission. And so the European Union passed the Digital Markets Act in 2022, which forced the platform to allow sideloading. Basically, in Europe, you can go to a website and get the apps from the website, not necessarily from the App Store. And so what they did is they basically broke that choke point open. So what I argue in this paper is that there's many strategies that governments are implementing. It's not that Bill Clinton was basically wrong. You can control the internet. The question is, how are you going to exercise that power? And so the first three that I showed, I argue, enhance network resilience. They make it more robust. There are other mechanisms, for example, hijacking a point of control, which I argue is what the NSA did with these landing points, which do not increase the resilience of the network. And so three basic conclusions: that the governance over the internet is shifting. So we used to have consensus-driven and global fora for these norm makings, and there is an order emerging now that is at a local level through architectural control, and this is what some are referring to as the infrastructural turn in internet governance. Also that infrastructures promote, enable, afford different interactions, and so this is something that architects in general think a lot about. Like if we place a nice lobby, people might engage more. If we don't put a lobby, people aren't going to engage within the building. Well, how do we manage those points of control? Do we disrupt them? Do we enhance them? And lastly, that points of control move. So they move vertically, and so Brazil might have put new undersea cables in order to circumvent US landing points. The US might have devolved power over ICANN, but what we have seen over the same period is that a lot of there has been a massive consolidation at the content layer. So the US now dominates content and storage through its companies. And so even though those points of control were disrupted, the US now manages new points of control that are creating questions. But it can also move horizontally. So some of the emerging tech, like Starlink, might reshape the importance of existing points of control, like undersea cable. So we might move at this layer of the stack within, or we might move up and down the stack. Those points of control might move up and down. So thank you very much, and reach out if you want access to the paper. It's still under review. Thank you.